Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar session. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping items. My name is Gina Catanazzo, and I am the Educational Technology Committee, ETC for short, representative for Humber College. The virtual Lunch and Learn webinar series is brought to you by the ETC. The ETC is comprised of members from all 24 colleges in Ontario, Canada. The sharing of ideas, best practices, and teaching and learning strategies related to the use of technologies inside and outside of the classroom is a central characteristic of the committee and the inspiration for this webinar series. In addition to this webinar, we have 7 more coming up in the series. Do visit our website to sign up for more. Our next webinar is Digital Learning Technology Bank on Friday, February 14th at 12 p.m. Want to facilitate a webinar? There will be no webinars during the summer term. However, we are now accepting volunteers for the fall 2020 term. To submit a proposal, visit our website. The ETC is also responsible for the annual Advancing Learning Conference. This year's conference will be held at Seneca College's King Campus from May 12th to 14th. The theme of the conference is Dare to be Curious. Visit the website at advancinglearning.ca for more information, to submit a proposal, and to register for the conference. Want to join our mailing list? Stay informed about upcoming webinars each term, opportunities to facilitate, and information about the Advancing Learning Conference. Visit the link to join our mailing list. And that's it. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Audrey Wubbenhorst. Audrey, I hope I said your last name correctly. If I didn't, please correct me. From Humber College, facilitating our webinar today. Listen Up, Podcasts as the New Textbook.
Thanks, Gina. I just want to share my screen. I hope people see the slides. Just bear with me a second. Hello, can people hear me? Okay, hands up. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my slides. Hang on. I'm sorry, Gina, I can't get the slides to show.
So if you go to the bottom right corner of your screen, you'll see a sort of box with an arrow, and that's where you're going to click to share your screen.
On the bottom right?
Mm-hmm.
Aha, okay. I'm so sorry, guys. Hang on. Okay, so now, is that better?
No, I'm still not seeing your slides. So you have to share your application or your screen. So once you click on that arrow, then you're going to share your application or screen. So you click on that, and then it gives you the option of which one to do.
Okay, here we go. I'm sharing my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, Gina, but the share button is just like not open there. Like I can't click on it.
Okay, so Um, do you see the panel on your right after you click on the square with the arrow? It says share blank whiteboard, share application screen, and share files. So click on share application / screen.
I know, and then there's a share button, but it's not like lit up for me to share.
Yeah, so you have to select, so it'll give you an option if you want to select your screen or your application windows. So you have to select which, there we go. So now,
I'm so sorry guys. Okay.
There we go, we got it.
All right, I apologize. Okay.
No problem.
All right, here we go. But listen, so thanks Gina for that introduction, and I'm to be here this afternoon, and I'm glad that there's so many people on the line. So I have some content. I'm going to tell you a little bit about an experiment that I did with some of my classes at Humber College. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor in the Public Relations Department at Humber College. So I teach a lot of different programs. Some are diplomas and some are post-grad, and we also have a degree program as well. So there's a wide variety of levels that we're teaching to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this idea came to be, how I rolled it out, and some student feedback. And then I have a few recommendations, podcasts that I used in my classroom, but of course I welcome your recommendations as well. And I'm happy to take questions at the end also. So one of the things that I came up with, really when I was assigned my courses, I took over from somebody who had retired, and we had a public relations book. First of all, we're in a discipline that doesn't have a ton of content available. We have one public relations book that's used across a number of different programs in Canada. And that book in and of itself, gets out of date quite quickly. And as you can imagine, we're living and breathing in the world of digital communications. So the PR world itself is changing really every day. And the kinds of jobs our students get, are very different from the kinds of jobs that I got when I was graduating from university. So I was looking for some other material that was easy and accessible, and as you can imagine, I didn't have a ton of time to prepare, so I was assigned the courses without a lot of lead time. So I had been interested in podcasts. I'd been listening to podcasts for a few years before I was assigned these courses, and I thought, I'm going to put them on my syllabus as an alternative to a textbook. And I found that they worked really well. So they're accessible resources. They can help cater to different learning styles and deliver unique information that keeps students engaged. Also, I find just the concept of storytelling helps to, build empathy with the students. I think it creates more maybe memorable moments than you might get with reading. And as I'm sure lots of people on the line know, we deal with such diverse learning styles at the college level that it's really good to offer some alternatives to sort of typical reading. Having said that, most podcasts, especially the ones that I would use, have a transcript available as well. So, really the mainstream producers like CBC, National Public Radio, and so on, they also transcribe the podcast so that if students, if they're hearing impaired, they could definitely read the podcast. But I also have a lot of international students or students who are ESL, so they can look at the transcripts as well. I did actually, the first year I launched this, I overheard a few students in my class saying, "Oh, I never listened to them. I just read the transcript," as if they had kind of found a loophole in my course. And I thought, okay, well, that's fine too. There's multiple ways that they can access them. And a lot of the podcasts as well that I chose offer a lot of supplementary resource and links, so you can use those either in your classroom or you can use them either in preparing your material. So additional resources, articles, and things like that you can draw on to develop a lesson plan. Also, I found that it really helped with students' focus. So I would have students saying to me, I listen to them on this TTC, or I, listen to them on my car. We have at Humber, especially I'm at the Lakeshore campus, we tend to be a commuters college. So a lot of students use that time to kind of catch up on these readings, which I thought was great actually, and something that unfortunately textbooks, are not possible textbooks. And of course, they're highly portable. Students can listen to them on the go. And all the ones that I chose for my classes were completely free. I mean, there's a lot of other subscriptions and things like that you could consider as well. But, they're free and accessible. And of course, we know that the cost of textbooks continues to rise. It helps to with that accessibility component. So what I did was I was teaching a course actually on investor relations, which is for my students, really is kind of the business course in my program. Many of my students don't have a ton of business experience. They don't have a lot of exposure to corporations. They haven't really worked a lot yet, right? So they just don't have that kind of sense of what the business world is like. And there was a series that came out by National Public Radio called How I Built This. And there's a host, his name is Guy Raz, he's pretty engaging. He interviewed a number of different entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies. So from some more modern companies like Shopify, which is a great Canadian success story, to the two guys that founded Instagram, to the woman who founded Bumble, an online dating site. So not only did he interview firsthand those entrepreneurs, so you got a really nice story. You got to kind of sit in their heads for a few minutes and figure out how those businesses came about. But also, a lot of the businesses that he chose were pretty modern corporations, so companies that didn't necessarily exist 10 or 12 years ago. So a little bit different from some of the other material available in teaching business cases tends to be from Ivy Business School or even Harvard Business School, where they usually pick maybe more mainstream, longer tenured companies. So this was a nice kind of alternative. There were a lot of companies that students could recognize and brands that they had worked with every day, which I think made it also pretty accessible. I also taught another course on emerging issues in public relations, and there I didn't necessarily choose one podcast series. I picked a whole bunch of different things, but every week we listened to a podcast. It could have been produced by CBC. It could also have been produced by BBC, National Public Radio. And those podcasts dealt with a lot of emerging issues. So there was one, for example, on fake news, another one on Twitter and some of the issues with Twitter. So again, there I curated maybe a 12-week syllabus and picked a different topic and a different podcast for each week. So there's different ways, obviously, you could handle it. But in the second class, that was really on emerging issues, I built an assignment around that particular podcast. So, for example, the assignment would be on fake news. Come and present to the class on some of the problems with fake news, some of the solutions for alleviating this problem, and so on. And then the podcast was kind of like the first source that students would use. So collectively, as a class, we would listen to that particular podcast as the weekly reading. But then the students who were presenting on that topic were expected to delve deeper and do some additional research, and then present that back to the class. So in both cases, though, we used the podcast kind of as cases, and maybe one particular group, so a group of 4 to 6. We do a lot of group work in our program, presented the case and did some supplementary research as well. And then just from an assessment point of view, so the students would be assessed who did the presentation or presented the case every week. And then also in both of those classes, I have a short midterm and an exam. So I would ask, maybe 1 or 2 questions on each podcast on the midterm or exam. Really, the questions were quite straightforward. And if the students listened and participated and sat through the presentation, they could probably get the right answer. But it was a way just of kind of testing the material. So then also the first year I launched this, I incorporated into my student feedback questionnaire. At Humber, we have now an online survey. It used to be paper-based, but an online survey where professors can go and add, I think, 3 additional questions each year. So I asked some additional questions that literally I went in and typed in to understand, kind of the level of engagement around this. And so the question was simply, did the podcast help you learn the key concepts of this course? 50% of students strongly agreed, 43% agreed. So again, pretty strong agreement on that. And then I had some verbatim comments here. People loved them. They thought they were great readings. In fact, I had a student write me in the summer, so this is sort of 2 or 3 months after the course had finished, and say that he still subscribed to it and he really enjoyed it. So it kind of turned a lot of people, I think, on to this component, and hopefully, really role modeled the fact that you can keep learning and keep staying current simply by listening to podcasts, which of course is something in a public relations program that we really want to emphasize, because being up to date on the news is an important part of being a strong public relations professional. So just a few ideas I wanted to throw out there to look for from a faculty point of view in assigning podcasts. So there's podcasts have really taken off in the last 10 years. And some are of better and worse quality. So certainly some are recorded in people's basements, which may be okay. But I looked for things that were really high quality in sound and content. So I looked at more the traditional producers. So again, the BBC, NPR, which is National Public Radio, and CBC. Again, these are kind of the big Western media players. Of course, if you were teaching a class that was more global, I'm sure there'd be a lot of other places to look as well. I like kind of choosing these providers, again, because they provide the transcripts and because the level of quality is pretty high. But there's certainly more grassroots podcasts as well. If you were teaching maybe social justice or community relations, there might be a lot of other places to look as well. And there's a lot of podcasts, too, that are produced by people who are the same age as our students, which I think would also be inspiring, I think, for many students. But again, I was looking for, podcasts that provide some kind of insight, offer a new voice, and maybe something hard to access. So, for example, a 45-minute interview with the two individuals that founded Instagram or founded Airbnb is not something that would come across or that would be readily available. So again, kind of that first person point of view to develop engagement, to develop empathy, and to really focus on that storytelling component. I do think you have to review them first. Even the BBC, I did put on a few, and some of the students had a hard time with the British accents, actually, some of my domestic students, which doesn't mean that they should necessarily come off, but just some things to be aware of. And I would review them again to remember some of the details. So usually on the day that we were doing a particular case in class, I would just set it up and play it on my car on the way to work so that I would just be like really familiar with the details. I did find, here and there, sometimes the students would maybe mix up some of the details of the podcast, and I would have to sort of correct them in class. And if I hadn't listened to it very, very recently, I probably wouldn't be as up to date myself. So again, I think listening to them on the way to class, or even just reviewing the transcripts right before class, just helps to refamiliarize yourself with the content, kind of the names of the individuals, and with the story that's being presented. So again, some things to think about. So high quality production. A lot of podcasts are amazing. They do a lot of great things with sound, with voice, with music. And I find the students, sort of the level of production does help to increase the level of engagement. Are its facts accurate and up to date? So, just like textbooks, sometimes, even a podcast from 2 or 3 years ago may be out of date. So there may be something a little bit more current. So this one class where I did the series from National Public Radio, How I Built This, they're releasing new podcasts every 2 or 3 weeks or so. So I usually update my syllabus, and I might swap out maybe a couple of the older ones with a couple of new ones. I don't necessarily change them 100%, but just keep the content as current as possible. And again, factually accurate, up to date, and offering something unique to students. So maybe interviews with leading experts, or, if you were teaching maybe a social issue, interviews with people who have experienced that issue. So there's something about kind of the firsthand component of a podcast that I think is really compelling. And as much as you can find content that really exploits that firsthand component, that's really, really, really useful. So I also came across this here. This is a project actually done by CBC Podcast. Just try to link to it here for a second. So what they did, what they did was they put together, they took a number of their key podcasts that relate to health and some that relate to Indigenous issues, and a number of teachers at the secondary school level, so high school teachers, have put together learning materials and teaching components really around those podcasts. So there's a link here just to a number of them. Now, this material is really at the high school level, but I think some of it could be used. So for example, there was a podcast on the province of Jamaica, which could be used for Black history. There's a couple there on Indigenous history, the Indian Act and things like that. And then a number of teachers from, I believe from Ontario, have developed, teaching kits, discussion questions and things like that around these podcasts. So again, this was written for the high school level, but I think probably a lot of it is transportable at the college level as well. So I think, especially if you're teaching social issues, there's probably a lot of good content and material, and it would be great actually if one day if we could have a college level version of some of these concepts as well. But I just wanted to highlight that because I know a lot of people are doing social justice and community issues, and there's a lot of great material available already. Then I also did, because I teach public relations, we use the podcast as a PR tool. So we look at some of the analytics around podcasts really as kind of an entry into social media performance and data analytics. So we look at things like analyzing the podcast, how many followers, how many readers, what's its consumption and reach, what's its sharing and engagement. We look at the comments that are posted around the podcast just as a way of developing rapport with audience, as a way of interacting with the audience, as a way of engaging with content and also analyzing content. And then we also discuss, at a high level, kind of the model around, many of the podcasts have advertisers, and we discuss kind of the business model as well. So that's just kind of looking at it maybe from more of a macro level, because we have public relations students who may be using podcasts as a tool for their clients in the future. And then again, I also did some in-class assignments. So I teach a writing class. So here, I just made this assignment up. You've been hired by a food delivery service that delivers organic foods. They're run by a CEO who's a graduate of Humber's culinary arts program. She's looking for exposure, source a podcast, and prepare a pitch for this podcast. And this would just be a quick in-class assignment. Find something, listen to an episode or two to understand what it's about, identify why you chose it. So looking at those analytics and reviews, and then drafting a pitch. So again, this is just using it really more as an assignment and looking at the podcast as a communications tool and developing some critical thinking around A, kind of selecting which one to choose, and then B, the concept of pitching the media. So here are just some recommendations. And again, I know we have people on the phone who have taught many, many courses and may have some other recommendations as well. This is the first one I used was on to do the fake news case. So this is really interviewing a journalist who spent a ton of time researching fake news. And it's about his research. It's about the concept of fake news, how it's kind of ballooned in the last few years, and what can be done about it. If you're doing politics, there's a great podcast called Canada Land. I mean, it's really around media consumption and the Canadian media. But there was one on Justin Trudeau winning the election, which my students were really into, and really they viewed in this podcast that he won through his social media platform. This is his first election. There's the whole series, if you teach marketing, on the Oprah Winfrey Show. One in particular was around the episode many of you might remember where everybody in the audience got a car. But this is a great podcast for kind of marketing, for media history, and of course using some big names like Oprah Winfrey. And then this is the one, how I built this on Instagram. So many of my students have been on Instagram for many years. So it's kind of an interesting podcast. I found they were really engaged with it because it just talks about really the business model of Instagram, how Instagram was founded and how it's kind of transformed over time, and also some of the business implications. It was purchased by Facebook, so how has that changed its original intent? What are some of the issues it's dealt with? It's had a lot of privacy issues and so on. And then another one here is just Planet Money, which if you're teaching banking, personal finance, there's a ton of good content there as well. This particular one was on kind of the Wells Fargo issue. So again, I think like they have a lot of these podcasts have a lot of legs depending on the topic that you're teaching, and they just provide a different point of view for students, and I find the engagement with them is quite high. So again, many of you probably are already there, but you can find them on the iTunes store. There's a lot of free apps like Overcast, where you can type in, for example, you could type in financial planning, or you could type in Black history, social justice. I mean, many different topics, and they tend to be, I think, even increasingly better kind of indexed and better categorized. So every time I look things up, I usually get more and more uses. And of course, the business itself is booming, so there's new content being added every day. So I'm just going to pause there and see if people have questions. Sorry. Okay, hold on. I'm just looking to see if there are questions here. Okay, so I'll just answer some of these questions that have come in. So I have had students develop their own podcast as part of a course. So I teach a writing course, and I had students storyboard. I think I gave them an idea, but I had them storyboard some of those ideas. I think one of them might have even, why they should come to Humber's public relations program, and then they had to interview one another and they had to edit it. And believe it or not, students can do all of this with an iPhone. So I thought they may have to access some pretty fancy software, but many of them were able to just sort it out, do the editing, and produce a podcast. And then with that particular assignment, I did that I think about a year ago. We spent the last class of the semester, I think I bought Timbits or something, and we played them all in class, which was really fun. And then the students had to give each other some feedback on the podcast. But they can do a ton of work, just easy editing with an iPhone, which is pretty unbelievable. Okay, and then someone else is asking me around, so the length of the podcast. I mean, most of the ones that I use there would be maybe 35 minutes. They all have a few commercials, so probably the content itself is about 30 minutes. And I find that's kind of enough. I kind of think of it as the something that's kind of manageable that they could do on their commute. If you were really wanting to go really in depth, there's a lot of different series. You could do like a 6-part series over 6 weeks or something like that. But in terms of kind of a weekly assignment, I think a half an hour or 40 minutes is pretty reasonable. Okay, I'm just scrolling through. So it looks like there's a lot of resources here as well. Are there any other questions or anything I can answer? Okay, looks like there's also some, okay, I can share the link. Maybe I can I'm just going to try to post this here. So this is the link, which is just a link to a CBC article, but it's really around, they've taken a number of podcasts around, it looked like they had a lot to do with Indigenous issues, Black history, and a couple of health issues or health topics as well. And a number of teachers have developed teaching kits and toolkits around delivering those podcasts in class. So things like discussion questions, ways to engage students with the content. So I think that's a useful kind of framework, especially if you're teaching those particular topics. Okay, do I invite students to find podcasts they're interested in and share? I mean, I've done that maybe informally. Usually, in my experience, I've set the syllabus and I've assigned the syllabus kind of week by week. You know, I probably could do more of that, a little bit more bottom up. But I think, you know, that's obviously it's a great idea. I've done maybe more informally, so like as a discussion or as a brainstorming question, what do you listen to? And I find, you know, they're probably as likely to listen to the kind of CBCs and NPRs as I am. So it's probably worth maybe spending more time figuring out what they're already listening to and trying to develop that into the component. Yeah, so I think, yeah, having students curate the content would be amazing. I guess I'm a little bit stuck sometimes by the expectation that kind of on week one I'm going to have all, you know, the 14-week class laid out. But it would be a great thing to figure out, or even to maybe ask the students from the previous semester what they listened to and then develop that into the content for the future, or even evaluate the content as well. Okay, I have the podcast on the syllabus, so it's literally week by week syllabus, and I put a link to the podcast. So I usually link to where they can find it on a desktop, but students can find it through their apps as well. And I would just put, I would put like National Public Radio, how I built this, episode 30, Instagram. So it's very clear. And I find they're pretty self-sufficient with finding the content. So in terms of the scoring and grading, the students' podcast, so I think you're asking about the ones that they produce themselves. Now I was teaching that for a writing class. So I think they had to not only submit the audio file, but they also had to submit the writing. So there was some writing in terms of an introduction to the podcast. They did some interviews. They had to submit the interview questions and a conclusion. So the writing piece was weighted pretty heavily, and then a few points for the production. But I was looking at things like what I was trying to test there from a writing perspective was when you're writing for audio, it's a little bit different than writing for print, and you know, should be kind of shorter sentences, a little bit more punchy, a lot of dialogue. And so it was testing, I think, some of those writing skills. That was for that particular class. I mean, I think you could use it in different ways. Maybe you could even have students do like an informational interview with somebody in the profession. You could experiment with a lot of different things. Just looking to see if there's other questions. On a podcast app, so somebody's asking a recommendation for a podcast. I mean, I find iTunes is pretty good, but there are tons of them, and students are quite savvy. Even when I had them develop a podcast, I was a little bit nervous about it because it's not my expertise at all. I mean, I've never produced anything like that, but I found they just kind of figured it out. You know, their technical capabilities are way beyond mine. So I see my role more as like introducing them maybe to new ideas and trying to get them to listen to new things. But they can certainly source it and find it pretty easily. Okay, somebody's asking, podcasts that are specifically geared or more appropriate to English language learners. That's a great question. You know, my dad always said that he learned how to speak English by listening to the CBC. So I think, you know, probably I would have, if you have ESL students, I would probably pick the Canadian produced podcasts, like the CBCs and things like that, because the accent is similar to what they're probably dealing with, you know, on a day-to-day basis. As I said, I even had students, domestic students, who had trouble listening to the BBC and felt like the journalists were speaking too quickly and they didn't understand the accents. So I don't think that's a reason, as I said, to take them off the syllabus, but it's just something to think about. But I think probably shorter, you know, CBC, everything they have on the radio is available online. So even if there was a 5-minute segment, you know, talking about an issue, you could find that and have students listen to it and ask them questions on it. I mean, that might be a way to test some of their listening skills as well. You know, you could have them listen to different components of maybe like Metro Morning if they're in Toronto, and then report back on what's happening in the city. So I think probably shorter ones as well would help, I think, ESL students. But as I said, I think also having the transcripts available, which CBC has, also helps the students to check back. So sometimes I do find, even some of the ones I chose that had a lot of business language, the students didn't quite get that, and they would refer back to the transcripts to get some of the business language and kind of look up some of the terms that they didn't really understand. So that would help, I think, as well for English language learners. Okay, you're asking about when they develop their own podcast, they send MP3 files. Exactly. So I actually did it all on Blackboard. They had to upload an MP3 file, an audio file, and then I just played them. And when I marked them, I just played them at home on my own computer. I found it went pretty simply. I think a few years ago, sometimes the files would be a lot bigger and they would be harder to upload, but now it seems to work just fine. Yeah, so again, they posted on Blackboard. When I worked at another school, we used D2L or Brightspace, and they did the same thing. They just posted it on that other learning management software too. So I think those softwares are pretty good now with MP3 files. Okay, I think I have a few more questions coming in, so I'll just wait a second here. Yeah, so as it happens, it is available as a podcast. Yeah, it is. All of those CBC shows, they are available almost immediately on iTunes. So, for example, the current, I think it airs at 9 or 9:30. I can't remember, but it airs in the morning, and then it's available as a podcast almost immediately after. So the CBC is quite good with turning the content around. From what I understand as well, I mean, CBC is really big in this space. They see it as kind of a new revenue stream as well. So CBC is definitely a great resource. But I guess, you know, depending on what you're teaching, there's so many other possibilities as well. There's so many political ones. There's a ton of material around community issues, social justice. There's a lot of, even CBC has produced a ton of great series on all kinds of things. Yeah, so Alexa is suggesting CBC front burner, short daily update on a current news item. Yeah, that's good. And the New York Times has one too. It's called the Daily, and so every day they drop, or every week, I think it's probably every weekday they drop an in-depth interview relating to like a breaking story. The only thing, I think those are amazing. It's a little hard to, you have to be really, I think, kind of nimble to build a lesson plan around something that, has happened that morning or has happened the day before. But nonetheless, it could be like if you developed it into a weekly discussion within your class that maybe was worth some participation marks. I think it could be manageable, and it gets students into the habit too of listening to the news on a daily basis, which I find kind of at this level, at this age, is not, it's just not common practice yet. Have I used podcasts to incorporate Indigenous content into my courses? So that's a great question. I've done other things, but I can't say, just given the topics that I've had, I haven't as much. I've done other things. So I teach business. I've done some Indigenous cases and things like that. There's not a lot of content around Indigenous businesses, which is something that's definitely a blind spot and a gap. I mean, if you go back to the CBC article, they refer to a number of them. So here's some: the North, Water, Indian Act. So these are some other ones. CBC did a whole series that I just can't think of right now about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's another one called Finding Cleo, which is about a number of Indigenous kids that were taken away from their families in the 50s and 60s. It's very, very heartbreaking, but it's very compelling. And it's a great history lesson. So those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I think it depends maybe if you're trying to get at what sort of subtopic you're teaching, but the CBC has quite a few. Oh, Canada Land as well, which I mentioned. Yeah, Canada Land talks a lot about Canadian media, and they had a series on Thunder Bay and some of the violence against Indigenous people in Thunder Bay. Again, these ones the ones I'm mentioning are amazing, very well researched, very well produced, also very heartbreaking. So I think, as a professor, I would just kind of prepare for that and probably listen to them pretty carefully. They're great resources, but pretty tough issues for sure. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely suitable. I think there's, and they're suitable for college level students for sure. Okay, well, I think that's it. I mean, I can, certainly I'm at Humber College. I'm on LinkedIn if anybody wants to reach out, or if you have any questions, or if you have some other recommendations to share as well. I'm certainly open to using some new ones in my class. But I guess just to kind of summarize, I think it's a great, podcasts are a great tool, especially for college learners who really are not going to spend a ton of time reading textbooks. I think the fact that they're free, that they tell great stories, and that they're just sort of easy and accessible, makes it really a great choice for our level of students. Oh, you're saying UDL and OER. Okay, so UDL would be around just Universal design. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that podcasts do check a lot of boxes for universal design, given the, the audio component, especially if they have a transcript. Yeah, and they are, I guess, in theory, they're open educational resources because they're free. Absolutely. I mean, increasingly people are putting subscriptions and price tags on things, but I think you can find so much for free. You probably don't need to go down that route. Often, sometimes you have to pay maybe a subscription fee, but it's just to take out the ads. So you should be aware, I think, too, as faculty, if you're designing them, that they often come with a few minutes of ads. So you kind of accept that. Sure. Well, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, that would be fun. Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm just okay, so the session is going to be recorded and will be available on the edtechontario.ca website. If anybody wants to reach out too, I mean, I can send the slides separately if you'd like to have them, or any of the links if you're interested. Let me know as well. Maybe I'll just put I'm just going to type in my email. As I said, I'm on LinkedIn too, so you can find me. You're going to provide the slides. Okay, Gina is going to provide the slides on the website, so that is great as well. But certainly reach out if you have any ideas, and it's been a pleasure being on the call. Oh, okay, thanks so much, guys. I'm going to close, and thanks, Gina, for organizing. I really appreciate it.
Audrey,
Yeah.
maybe stop sharing your screen for now. And
Okay.
yeah, perfect. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind emailing me those slides, and then I'll put that up with the recording.
Okay, that's awesome. We'll send it in a few minutes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gina. I'm sorry about the rocky start.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.